Hi creatives! Today we're going to create an infographic all the way from getting the text from your client to creating a really clever layout and beautiful and impactful design. Infographics are really valuable to clients because they can be used in so many different ways, from sharing it in your newsletter, for example, to getting found on Google search. An infographic can be basically any graphic where you're combining text and imagery to explain a more complex topic in an easy way. Some are super minimalist and are just trying to get one point across, while some are a little bit more intricate and maybe have a lot more illustrations or a slightly less traditional layout, for example. The more intricate ones are my absolute favorite, so today we're going to create a really illustrated infographic all about the difference between organic farming and regenerative farming. I think this is a great topic for an infographic because it's something people are interested in, but they might not already know all the answers or all the little intricate details. The goal is to get them interested in the subject and give them a clear overview of all the key points. We also want to add a call to action so that the people who are reading it can go and visit the website of the company that we're promoting. Before we start, I just want to share something a little bit special with you. We're actually creating a multiple part series here on the YouTube channel all about how to run an agency. So we're going to cover absolutely everything from creating proposals and design agreements to how to create a great relationship with your clients, and of course all of the different design stages like coming up with great ideas for your concepts and how to hand off your projects. If you have any questions at all that you would like us to include, we've actually set up a poll on the community page, so you can go and add your question there in the comments or vote for one of the options that we already put up. Also make sure that you subscribe if you're interested in that series so you'll know as soon as it's out. Okay, now let's start creating. The first thing I like to do is to have a look at the text that my client has sent over. It usually looks something like this, just plain text and maybe a few titles. The first thing we want to do is just figure out the hierarchy of the text, so which information is most important and if there's any structure that we can use to shape our layout. In this case, we can see a quick intro about the conventional farming, and then we have information and benefits about each of the two different farming practices, and a little bit extra about regenerative farming, and finally a call to action. Before we start designing, I also want to put together a mood board to make sure that I have lots of references to go back to when I'm designing, but also just to check in with my client and make sure we're on the same page. There's a really great function in Mimmimoo where you can use their extension and just add images straight to a board instead of having to download them first. For the mood board, I want to find two types of images. The first one is examples of interesting infographics that can just give me inspiration for the layout or how they use text, for example. The second type are images that show subject matter. So in this case, I want to create illustrations around farming. So I try to look for imagery that works well with growing food, vegetables, animals on the farm, that type of imagery. You want to make sure that when you're creating your mood board, you have lots of different references so that you don't end up having an end result that looks really similar to one or two images. Some of you asked how I pick colors for projects, so I thought I would show you a little bit about my process here. Having my mood board here in Mimmimoo, I can actually use the eyedropper and start looking for color combinations that work. In this case, I know that I need a few shades of green and brown for the plants and the soil, but I also want some brighter colors that stand out a bit more, like flowers and key information that people will want to stand out, for example. I know I want a warm and friendly color palette, so I want to avoid blue and purple tones, and I want maybe a beige background that feels a little bit warmer than just a plain white. You can see that I try lots of options and I make sure that the colors look really nice all together, so it can take a bit of trial and error. I also like to sample from different images so I don't copy one exact color palette from one project. Now that we have lots of great inspiration for our infographic, I want to start by just creating the basic layout of the infographic structure. So we need a section right at the top for the title and the intro. We could then have two sections that have a clear divide in the middle for the two practices, and then an area underneath for the extra information and then the call to action. We also want to add in the sources. That's something we always want to do for infographics, so I'll make a little space at the bottom. I also make a little space for the company logo at the top because that's something that clients typically want to include. Then I try to write out some of the base text just to know where it will go and see if there's like a logical way to incorporate where the illustrations can go. At first, I just block out areas, and then as I have ideas, I start drawing them and start refining. So I add a rough sketch for the illustrations that I think could fit in well. If I feel stuck, I just refer back to my mood board and look for things that make sense. The job of an infographic is to guide the reader through the text, and there are a couple of different ways to do that. We need to think about how people read, so in this case it will be read from left to right and from top to bottom. I think having a graphic that joins the two sides in the middle could be an interesting kind of focal point, and we can annotate the differences and show the benefits that way. Let's add in some more detail and I'll show you what my final rough sketch looks like. Okay, so this is what I ended up with. It has a clear layout and I know exactly what I need to draw for each area. The next step for me is to create a color rough where I just super quickly add in all the color blocks I will use. This doesn't have to be neat at all. I will actually delete this layer later. It's just for me to know what colors to use and make sure that it will all work nicely together. It can seem like kind of an unnecessary step, but it actually saves a lot of time. Next, I start creating my actual illustration. So you could have a step in between here where you create a really neat sketch, but since I'm not using an outline in this graphic, I will just create the illustration right away. If you're working with a new client, it could also be a great idea to send them the clean outline before you continue into doing your full illustration, just to make sure the layout and design works before you start creating the full project that takes a lot more time. I make sure to create everything in its own layer so that I can come back and edit, but also so that I can add textures to specific areas, for example. I'm working in Procreate today, but you could do the exact same process in Adobe Illustrator by just importing your sketch and using the pen tool to create your neat illustration. For some areas, it's really clear how the result will look, and in some areas of my sketch are a little bit more rough. So I spend more time here making sure it's all clean and clear. Once I have all of the main areas of my illustration laid out and colored in, I like to add the text before I do all the details, just to make sure that it fits nicely and I can add those little details around the text to make it feel extra custom. You can absolutely have done this way earlier, but I like to have a bit more freedom when I create the illustration, just to add in the last details once the text is set. Using the right typeface can really make or break your work, so make sure you use a typeface that's really easy to read, and I suggest sticking to 1 or 2 only. The goal is for the information and the illustration to be the hero, so we just want the text to support that. I think adding all these details makes all the difference and it can really elevate your illustration. It just brings so much more character and it helps make the design a lot more memorable. Next, I'm adding textures and shadows, little areas in the background of the illustration, just to make sure that it has a little bit more visual impact and is a little bit more visually interesting. In Procreate, I use a brush set from an illustrator called Mimmimoo, and I'll add it in the description because I've been really loving it so far. To add the texture, I add a new layer and make it a clipping mask. I then set it to multiply and I use the same color or sometimes a slightly darker color and add the shading that way. Try it out and see what technique works best for you. If you already have an illustration style that you're really comfortable with, stick with that one. We're almost done, so the last thing to do is to export the artwork and send it to my client. I typically offer both PDF, TIFF, and JPEG because it gives the client a lot of options for sharing the graphic. So if it's been created in Illustrator, I might also share an SVG file. This is what the final design came out like. Anytime I work on illustration, it just makes me so happy, so I had so much fun creating this one. I think it would be so much fun to have a little infographic challenge, so if you watch this and you're super excited about creating an infographic of your own, you could post it to your social media account and use the hashtag infographic challenge. And make sure to @ me as well, so that we can have a look and I can see all the wonderful things that you create. I really hope you found this helpful. Don't forget to ask your questions in the community post so that we can make sure to include it in the upcoming series. If you want to learn more about illustration, I actually created one on illustration for branding, so I'll put that here on the screen for you. Thank you so much for watching. Good luck with your projects and see you next time.